What's up, guys? It's Dr. Tim Jackson with another episode of the Boss Body Podcast. Today, I have Dr. Jenny Powers. She is the author of a brand new book on evolutionary biology and circadian mismatch.
While I make every effort to broadcast correct information, I'm also still learning. I will double check all my facts, but realize that healthcare is a constantly changing science and art. One doctor or healthcare provider may have a different way of doing things from another. I welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. I take no money from supplement or device companies. By listening to this podcast or reading this blog, you agree not to use this podcast or blog as medical advice or to treat any medical condition in either yourself or others, including but not limited to patients that you are treating. Consult your healthcare provider for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast or the website. Under no circumstances shall any guests or contributors to the podcast or blog or any employees, associates, or affiliates of the Boss Body Podcast be responsible for damages arising from use of the podcast or the blog. This blog or podcast should not be used in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing the standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or the blog.
Welcome to the show, Dr. Jenny.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So tell us, what's the name of your book and what motivated you and your co-author to write about it?
Yeah, well, the book is called On the Origin of Being. So you can kind of see we paid homage to Charles Darwin there on the origin of species. But then the subtitle is Understanding the Science of Evolution to Enhance Your Quality of Life. And really the underlying hypothesis of the book is that, we evolved for millions and millions of years as hunter-gatherers. We were very, in alignment with the environment. We had really good homeostasis. We were evolved to thrive. And then our world started changing so quickly that the way that we evolved to live and the way we were living the gap started increasing and increasing and increasing. And so the evolutionary mismatch hypothesis is that, there's a mismatch between our genetics and our world, the way that the modern world compels us to live. And because we're not living in a way that our biology was created to live, we have all kinds of pathology, the diseases of modernity. And so it's kind of interesting, the story of how I started writing this book. I was a PhD in immunology, I'd had lots of success, and I was on this race of, the modern world, go faster, do better, achieve. My self-worth was all wrapped up in my success, but I wasn't happy. And so probably the best thing I did was leave academia, just to kind of reset. Though at the time I was blaming myself that I couldn't handle it. Something was wrong with me. And then I started something that I'd always wanted to do, but just didn't seem successful enough, I guess, was to be a writer. And so while I was starting to kind of recover from being burned out and exploring spirituality and things, to try to help my depression, I started writing. And I started writing middle grade fiction, which is so different from anything I'd ever done before. It was really fun. I have a couple of manuscripts that I don't know if they'll go anywhere or not. We'll see. But then I was looking around for another job, and I found Luke. And Luke Comer is kind of this lifelong academic visionary, I guess. He's done so much research on when he was having his own kind of crisis of life. He started really researching nutrition and was starting to see he was starting to see the mismatch hypothesis in nutrition. And then everywhere he looked, he saw it. And so when we met, he said that, he had this thing kicking around in his head for many, many years, maybe 10 years. He's like, well, would you be interested in researching and writing it? So he had the vision, and he had the whole kind of everything mapped out. But when I started writing it, it was like a blank slate. And when I was talking with him, though, everything that he said, I think I had talked to you about this earlier, light bulbs were going off in my head. Like, oh, maybe there's not something wrong with me. Maybe there's something wrong with the way that we're living. And so I got really, inspired by writing the book. I feel like the book kind of changed my life in many ways, put me on a different trajectory career-wise. I mean, I wouldn't have expected to, have a nonfiction sort of pop science self-help book out there. Um, but also in the writing, I just learned so much about so we had actually have 10 categories that we explore this mismatch in. The first four are sleep, nutrition, work and rest, and our relationship with nature. And those four are the subject of our first book. There we have two other books coming, hopefully, in the next couple of years. The next one deals with more social groups, social issues, social groups, child rearing, the sexes, and then the final book has to do with kind of cultural evolution, the arts, rituals, celebrations, ceremonies, religion. Um, and so I kind of feel like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have the basic needs, and then, as you go up the top. So we kind of start with the basics, and that's what this book is about. And then we go a little bit more complex, and then we go even a little bit more complex once we get to culture. So that's the book that he kind of laid out for me. Um, we wanted to explore and teach people how we got to where we are, so they can see how far away we are from how we evolved, and then kind of give people some practical advice to how to kind of be in the modern world, because we don't want to go back and live 15,000 years ago. But if we can live in the modern world and bring some things forward into our lives, I think it will help us. There's this thing called, health span versus lifespan. I'm
Mhm.
sure you, with what you do, you're trying to increase everybody's health span,
Right.
um, because all of the non-communicable diseases of modernity, they show up later in life, even though the seeds are planted much earlier.
Right.
Um, but we're just hoping that, people who read the book, are maybe inspired to start making those small lifestyle changes and understand the meaning why underneath, why, they should make those lifestyle changes. So
Yeah, absolutely. I
basically,
see, we were talking about this before we started recording, but in academia, people are bickering back and forth over the minutia, and I'm like, they're really missing the point. At the end of the day, we weren't, there's no such thing as a gluten deficiency. I've never seen a patient with a gluten deficiency. You know, there's, I've had patients where they, eat gluten in the United States, they get severely bloated, they go to Europe, there's no glyphosate allowed there, they're totally fine. But a lot of times I think in academia, they want to see like 97,000 studies, on everything. And I'm like, maybe a better question is, do we need a study for that? Right? Like, okay, non-native EMFs, for example. Like we know our bodies run on voltage. And if PEMF alters the voltage in a positive manner, then we can also alter the voltage in a negative manner. And, there's a group of scientists, PhD level scientists, I think 270 something, who belong to this society where they've basically been banned from academia because they just reported their results. But, the funding was a lot of times by big tech.
hmm,
And so, the universities were like, you got to go. But yeah, we have, emails coming in, text messages, cell phones, and we're exposed to so much information today. I mean, I think it's great, but it can also be overwhelming. And if it's overwhelming to me, and
mhm,
I do this for a living, I can
right?
only imagine what the layperson outside of the medical field, how they feel, because that's just another sympathetic stressor, right?
Yeah. Well, I feel like, you know, you're right. It's not just people want to research, like have a research paper and research one aspect and get results, but it's so much more complex than that. There's so many environmental factors out there. There's genetic factors. Um, There are, choices that people make with their lives that
Mhm.
are factors. And so I don't think anything can be run in a vacuum with just one thing or another. The world is so different from how, not just, in the ways that we talk about. And we haven't lived here long enough, and we haven't lived in this modern world long enough to know like the consequences of all of our technology, the consequences. Well, I think we're starting to learn the consequences of our nutrition and our lifestyles. Um, but I think, 100 years from now, we're going to look back and we're going to be like, I can't believe we did this, or, thank goodness we're not doing this anymore. So hopefully, more and more people will just learn about it, because I think a lot of people are just confused.
Yeah.
There's too much information out there. And each person who's like touting a way of life or diet or whatever is like, this is the only way. But if everyone says this is the only way, what are people supposed to think? So,
Right.
what I really appreciated about researching this book is I learned how human beings are so special because of our intelligence, and we can adapt using our brains. We don't have to necessarily evolve. Um, we can adapt a little bit using epigenetics, if we can alter the expression of our genes. But we really, once we became really intelligent, we could think our way and use our behaviors to adapt to situations. And so I feel like because we're caught up in this modern wave, that we are not really um, in touch with that. So I'm hoping that as more and more people like get in touch with, this is how far away we are from how we used to live, more people get on the bandwagon. I really enjoyed like getting on social media, for this book, because I wasn't on social media for such a long time, and finding like the health and wellness um, community. It was like, having things echoed back to me that I had discovered, not discovered personally, but like put together in the book. Um, and so it was kind of like a big, confirmation, like, okay, there's lots of people working on this. Then we just got to make it a bigger, get the momentum going and make it a bigger wave of people. Because it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to swim the other direction when
Yeah,
people are
it it is. I mean,
mindless.
but no one, someone put it to me like this a couple of years ago. People will throw stones at you while you're living, and then posthumously they'll use those same stones to erect a monument in your honor.
Huh.
So, and I think that was really eloquently said. I think a lot of times people get so dogmatic, and I'm always open to being wrong about anything. And I tell everyone, what you hear me say today, it's going to be different 5 years from now
Mhm.
because I'm constantly learning. And I do the best I can with the knowledge I have at the time, but it's impossible for anyone to know everything.
Right.
But like, let's take something like our light environment, right? So I got this light for the podcast shining on me. I got the overhead artificial blue lights. At night, I look like a giant bug because I have the blue blockers that wrap around. Yes, there you go. Exactly. And
Yep.
mine, so the brand I have prior to that, I had the ones that did not wrap around the eye. And I saw a little bit of improvement. But when I switched to the ones that are
Mm.
like the sports bands, I was tripping over stuff in my house. They work a little too well. Like they even have a giant warning on the box that say, "Do not drive with these on," because they're that effective.
Yeah,
Um,
wow.
but we are constantly looking at our phones, getting a dopamine hit. I would tell most of my guests the gym that I go to, and I think this is the case at most gyms, but especially the females with the spandex leggings, they make the pockets now for your cell phone, like literally inches from your genitals.
Mm.
And you add that on top of the forever chemicals that are in the clothing and whatever else is in them. And that's not good. But I literally see people who can't put their phone down for one set of one exercise. Like we're talking 60 seconds max.
Mm. Yeah.
And I mean, I think it's come out now. I actually know it has, where the social media giants, they hired clinical psychologists and they said, what can we do to get people to spend more time on our app? So, and then the only way you can not feel anxious is to get back on them.
Mhm.
So then you have this digital dementia sort of that's happening. Not just the damage to the mitochondria in the eye, which we'll get to in a minute, but it's signaling to us that it's daylight out when
Mhm.
our ancestors were around either a campfire or they just went to sleep, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Um, it's funny because that's like circadian rhythms, I feel like is one of the one thing that kind of is this direct line back to the very beginning of life. Because life needed to figure out how to adapt to the cycles of the earth, day, night, seasons, those kinds of things. And so the very first cells on earth knew, like, okay, during the day we do photosynthesis, but we don't do cell division during the day because we don't want to get DNA damage. So we do cell division at night. So the very first life needed to have those mechanisms in just single cells to figure out how to keep in sync, so your body and your environment are in sync. And so, when we were hunter gatherers, our ancestors, they'd wake up and they'd have bright sunlight in the morning, and it'd kind of be really bright, and then as the sun went down, they get less and less and less, and then you're right, moonlight, firelight, that's all it was. But nowadays we wake up, so if this is like maximum sunlight and this is dark over here.
Mhm.
We wake up and like we're just right here. So it's like
Yeah,
we're in this twilight. We're not really
right.
bright, we're not really dark. We're always in the same intensity of light.
Yeah,
And our circadian rhythms just don't know what to do with that. And
no,
circadian rhythms do so much more than just regulate sleep. They regulate hormone production, they regulate, body temperature, digestion. I mean, all these kinds of things that are in a cycle. Our body wants to do things in a certain order at a certain time of day, and we're just all mixed up.
yeah, absolutely. That's very well said. And I think a lot of times people get confused about, like, I saw a guy who he's a doctor, well, a doctor of dental science, but he said online like a year or so ago that the time of day that you eat does not matter. And I'm like, this is just I went to undergrad with this guy. So I mean, I know he's smart academic in the academic sense, but like first of all, our body temperature has to drop for us to go to sleep, number one.
Mhm.
Number two, bodybuilders have gotten it right for over 100 years. They want it to be in bed by 9:30 to get the spike in growth hormone, to get their liver detoxifying. But if you just ate 45 minutes before that, your body is going to be diverting resources to other areas.
Mhm.
So then that detoxification doesn't happen, the deep sleep doesn't happen.
Mhm.
And so, like you said, it's not
Cellular
just,
repair.
yes, cellular repair and the intracellular NAD plus pools. I mean, a lot of people are taking it supplementally, which is fine. I think that's great. But, if you're not doing your circadian rhythms correctly, you don't have the right entrainment, and you're just injecting NAD, you're kind of missing the point.
Right, right. Exactly. Unless you knew exactly when is the best time for your body to get this jolt. And I
Right.
also think, we lived for, I don't know, up until, 50 years ago, we lived without supplements. And I know people like supplements help people and there's value to them. But if someone's not addressing their underlying lifestyle condition or trying to I feel like some people it's potentially supplements can be used as a band-aid, or because or they just throw their money down the drain because they're not working because the underlying the lifestyle changes aren't happening. So you might be supplementing, your NAD plus, but everything else is out of whack. So you're just basically, I heard someone say, you're paying for expensive urine or something like that. It was just, I was like, I'm going to remember that. Um, your body, if your body's not optimized and functioning properly, it's not going to use the supplements that you're giving it anyway.
Yeah,
So,
I've heard that expression too, but I would give a little bit of pushback because when we test, like you were an athlete, D1 athlete, when we test athletes for steroid and performance enhancing drugs, we test their urine, and if it's in there, we say, oh, they're positive. But then when we test someone's urine and it has, B vitamins, let's say B not folinic acid, They say, oh, see, it was wasted. I'm like, no, that your
Mm.
body used it. So like it can't be both
I see what you
ways.
mean. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I see what you mean.
And so, but I mean, I understand what you're saying about, and that's why my opt-in ebook on my website is called Beyond Green Allopathy. And then I realized that I basically myself and like three other people on the planet knew what green allopathy was.
Hmm.
But basically, what I call it is, you came to me, you're a client or a patient, and you're on 12 medication. I said, Dr. Ginny, I got you. And then we just switch out the meds for supplements. Well, you'll have less side effects, most likely. But is it really getting to the root cause?
Hmm.
No. And some people I get lists of supplements they're taking. Like I had one lady last week, like 25, 26 supplements.
Oh my
And
goodness.
I said, your kidneys are gonna scream at you at some point.
Yeah.
I don't even take that many, and I've been doing this for a long time. But I think we're never gonna stop being exposed to toxins,
Hmm.
at least not in our lifetime.
Correct.
So I do take a binder, once a day. I take a multi-mineral. I take a K2 for arterial health. I do peptides here and there as needed, um, and fulvic and humic acid. And I have a lot of biohacking gadgets, but I also, that's not in exchange of my circadian rhythm and lifestyle, it's to enhance it.
Hmm.
Um, so I
Well,
have
it's
red
also,
light.
I think those things are important because there's one thing we can control, and that's our behavior and our choices, but we can't control what's going on around us. Our
Right,
environment, our inherently toxic environment, it's not something that we can just, leave. We're not just going to go all live in the woods. We have to live
right.
in the world we live in. And, taking things like that to, you're still, I mean, you're a functional medicine guy. You're still addressing all these underlying causes, but then what was interesting is learning about like the accumulative effect of all of the things that we're exposed to. You think, oh, it's just, that's not going to hurt me. And that's not going to hurt me. But there's like thousands of things that it's like, oh, that's not going to hurt me. But all of those things together will hurt you. And that was something that
Yeah.
I didn't really realize, for the longest time. Um, so being able to protect yourself from the toxic environment while you're changing your lifestyle to address those underlying problems, I think that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the biohacking gadgets are great. I do my red light therapy every morning. I have an EMR tech full body panel. So I love that. I mean, I still get morning sunlight, but I also do the red light therapy for workout recovery and skin health and decreased inflammation, things like that. But what you spoke about in terms of the 1 + 1 = 14 sort of phenomenon in psychology, they call it the five phenomenon. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Hmm.
But when I read a study and they'll evaluate mercury and they'll say, oh, it's safe at this level. I've never once, including in myself, and I've been detoxing since 2005, seen someone that just had a little bit of mercury or a little bit of
Hmm.
aluminum. And, you know, they bioaccumulate, right? Over years.
Well, and
In
now
the,
all the little plastics,
yeah,
the
exactly.
tiny bioplastics. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you have the
What
microplastics, you
yeah,
have the forever
microplastics.
chemicals.
Yeah.
I just had Darren Olean from Down to Earth on Netflix with Zach Efron.
I
Had him
listened
on
to
the
that
show.
episode. I listened to that
Yeah.
episode. Yeah.
And he had I think it was 9 or 10 PhD scientists from all over the US working on his book for over 2 years, sifting through the data. And he said, when we hear opinions about like, oh, this isn't harmful, that isn't harmful, it's not coming from the expert on the topic. And usually there's some funding from the company that stands to
Yep.
benefit, right? And so a lot of these things we don't know how to get out of our bodies, right? And so the average umbilical cord has between 250 to 300 known carcinogens in today's
Jeez.
babies. And that's just carcinogens, that doesn't count pesticides, endocrine disruptors, things like that. And so um, when you mentioned, the work-life balance, work-rest balance, that constant fight or flight state, like,
Mm.
first of all, our ancestors were never working that much. a few hours a day. And then, spending time with the family unit and community, which now, for example, in my neighborhood, I don't know. I know the neighbors on that side. I don't know these neighbors, never talked to them. So that sense of community is not there. You don't feel supported. And, when you look at the blue zones, I'm not
Yep.
promoting anyone smoke, but you see people who smoke, who drink, and you're like, how did they live to be 105? And a lot of people will just chalk it up to genetics, but they have a strong sense of purpose and they have strong social ties. And I think those two, you can't out supplement or out biohack those two things.
That's very, very true. We talk a lot about that in the next series of books that, well, not series, this is a series of books. This first book just covers those four things. So I don't remember, did we talk about this before or while we were recording?
The four, so it was
Okay.
sleep, diet,
Yeah, sleep,
nutrition, circadian
nutrition,
rhythm.
work and rest, and nature. And this is our first book, but there's two more books coming out, and the next book focuses on the social needs. So we talk a lot about that. We have, the loneliness epidemic that we're having right now. And then the last book talks like even higher order stuff, like our cultural needs, the arts, religion, ceremonies, rituals, those kinds of things. And what was amazing when when Luke set this out, a lot of the stuff I didn't, there were some things like, of course, nutrition and you should eat better. You generally know, sleep hygiene, but you didn't know the reasons behind them. Um, but researching like the arts and rituals and how these things are like leaving our society, people don't think they're important. I learned so much about how much the interpersonal relationships are like can out, if nutrition's here, relationships are here. I mean, it's just as
Yeah,
important as a part of a balanced life, to have people in your life. We're social creatures.
absolutely. I mean, if we look back even, 100, years ago, if you and I lived in the same community and I was under the weather, you and your family would rally to help me. And then if something happened to one of you guys, vice versa, everyone would rally around you guys. And there's a lot to be said for that. I think it ties in to the reptilian brain, the monkey mind, however you choose to phrase it, of, sense of safety and security.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, there's a loneliness epidemic. And Dr. Phil McGraw, he has his own media channel now, but he talks about how during the pandemic, there was a 50 to 60% decrease in referrals for kids and pediatric patients to specialists, and kids that were in school who were made to go home, we sent them right back into the hands of their abusers if they were experiencing abuse. That on top of the plexiglass around your desk and everything, we still don't know how damaging that could be. And in kids it had a 99% survival rate. And so I think the things that we did, it wasn't based in science, let's just put it that way, right? I mean, it was people in politics making medical decisions with no science, medical knowledge. And I think that's problematic. But yeah, I mean, in terms of social psychology, originally was going to be a psychologist. I took like 9 or 10 psychology courses, but I decided I like biochemistry and physiology too much. But I think, every thought has a physiological consequence. And when we talk about the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system, that's most easily enhanced by positive, strong social connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, the mind body connection and all like the gut mind connection and the gut body, there are all these connections that I think in the past, researchers have kept them separate. We're researching this, we're researching it. But the holistic part, I think medicine needs to go, all medicine needs to go to this holistic approach because it's not, the symptom, it might be a symptom of what they're getting treated for, but there might be 5 other symptoms that they're getting treated for this symptom for this disease, but it's never going to get better because there's all these other things over here, but they found the answer. So you know, this should work. Let's increase their dose. You know, I feel like human beings, our bodies are so complex. In fact, like the more I learned, you know, in immunology and the more I learned about our ancestors and how we evolved, it's just amazing. We are so amazing about how we exist and how we can have this conversation right now, even, and how we can heal and all of
Mhm.
these things. And that, you know, nothing can be studied in a vacuum. You know, when a
Right.
lot of the nutritional studies were studied just like as with one, you know, one nutrient or one
Mhm.
vitamin or one, and so I think the world is starting to realize that it's all the interconnections um, and so I think, you know, just like with some of the other things, the world's heading that direction, but it's going to be painful until we get there.
Absolutely. And in terms of, our, psychological development and social development, I think it's extremely important for kids, but also as adults.
Mhm.
Not everyone has the luxury of having a healthy family unit.
Mhm.
So I had Dr. Cassie Smith, an endocrinologist in Oklahoma, on the show, and her husband's in real estate, but we were only semi-joking, talking about one day having a community somewhere of like-minded, health-conscious people, where we had a community biohacking center, a community garden.
Mhm.
Everyone had, an area for a garden. Things
Permaculture.
like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, permaculture. I love that.
Exactly. And so, I mean, I think we need to get back to that, growing our own food instead of
Mhm.
outsourcing it to, these third party companies. And it always cracks me up when I go into the grocery store and I see a label, and it says, contains 12 vitamins and minerals. And I'm like, that's supposed to be in there. That's what food is. But they try to, spin
Yeah,
it
yeah,
so that to make you
yeah.
think that you're getting something extra.
Right.
And
Well,
I'm
you were
like, no, no,
talking
no,
about, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, no, no. They try to spin it to make
Yeah,
you think you're getting something extra.
yeah, yeah. Um, we were talking about, you know, the research that people that you know are doing and the big companies, you know, so there are big companies that are influence researching nutritional
Mhm.
nutrition, and all these big food companies hired people who understood, you know, brain biology and, you know, and so they were, you know, like the phones. That's right. It was, you were talking about phones. How do I make these people want to be on our app longer? The food companies are
Mhm.
the same way. How do we
Mhm.
get these people to eat our food more and to eat
Mhm.
more of it? And so the same things are coming out. Like, okay, hyper palatable food. Well, when we were evolving and when we didn't have all this excess, we needed hyperpalatable, you know, we craved hyperpalatable food. We craved um energy dense food. But when we ate that energy dense food, we ate everything with it, you know, all the vitamins, minerals, seeds, skins, all of that stuff. You know, we never
Yeah.
just ate one component in isolation like refined sugar. But
Right.
it's almost like the people, the food companies have learned how to hijack our evolution and realize like, okay, the feedback mechanisms, the dopamine you get when you eat sugar, well, that's an evolutionary thing. Let's use it to our advantage. You know, let's put more sugar. Let's put up all these things that create sensations and create almost you know, well, addiction. I mean, it
Right.
basically is kind of the same mechanism as addiction. So,
Right.
and it's the same mechanism as phones. People are addicted to their phones. They're
Mhm.
hacking into brain science and how we evolved.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you used the phrase in your bio about how nature was the original biohacker. Can you
Mhm.
expand on what you meant by that?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because when we were writing the book, I didn't even really know what biohacking was. It wasn't until after, um, and I was looking into it, and what biohackers do is they kind of experiment on themselves. They like find different things to try, small incremental things, and then they do it for a while, and then they see how they feel, right? And so I kind of made the analogy that it's kind of like it's what evolution did, what Mother Nature did with evolution. So all of these small little changes that happen naturally, you know, in our genome, there were these little small incremental changes. And then it was a big experiment. Like, okay, did this change work? All right, if it did work, then if it made somebody, it made a creature more able to survive, more likely to pass those genes on, it's a positive, trait, then it'll stay going. But if it made the creature sick or made them not able to pass their genes on or easier to catch or whatever, that gene would, that mutation would not be continued on in the genome. So I
Right.
feel like Mother Nature like did these tiny little, DNA hacks, and every single time, if it worked, it kept going. If it didn't work, it got her totally, taken out. So that's how I feel like Mother Nature did this biohacking in this huge, millions of years kind of clinical trial. And so basically, evolution biohacked our bodies to survive and thrive in the environment in which we evolved in, which we don't
Mhm.
live in anymore.
Right.
So a lot of things that biohacking do is return to that. Biohacking, getting light, getting supplements, things that you would normally get for food, the exercise, the community. There's all of these things that are kind of like a restoration of how Mother Nature hacked us to be. Um, and so, yeah, that was just like I was kind of like, oh yeah, Mother Nature's the original biohacker. And so
Absolutely.
that's what I meant by that.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, n equals one. I remember in my doctorate program, being told, oh, well, a textbook is inferior knowledge. But if you look at it, for example, I'll just give you an example I know. Growth hormone. To test growth hormone accurately, IGF-1 is normal in 50% of people with low growth hormone levels. So testing IGF-1, even though people will cite this study and that study, and this goes back to the textbook of, I think it's endocrinology from 1980 something. You have to do what's called a glucagon stimulation test to really show growth hormone levels being insufficient. And so I think textbooks are good. There's plenty of things, and what makes a study good is whether or not it was designed well, not that it was published yesterday. There's
Hmm.
plenty of things from the 90s that we have not implemented into our daily lifestyle that could benefit everyone.
Hmm.
And the end of every paper says, "Oh, well, we this data is great, but we need more studies." And I'm like, okay, at what point do we stop, doing studies and start implementing?
Hmm.
Paul Check has a great saying. There's information and there's knowledge. Knowledge is when you take information and change someone's life for the better.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like, well, I've seen it because when I was going through my doctoral program, there were MD PhDs, because there's the research where we're not necessarily dealing with human beings all the time. We're with cells and it's very small, and we write these papers. And then there's medicine, where they're treating, there's not a whole lot of crosstalk. There's more and more now. And I think um, people who are more like holistic and let's try this, let's try that, kind of have a more biohacker, more knowledge based instead of, training based approach to medicine. Um, that information, the studies are going to be integrated better in a setting like where you are
Mhm.
working, rather than in these big institutions. Um, so and actually that's what biohacking wanted to do. Biohacking wanted to take experimenting out of these big institutions and give them to people like DIY scientists,
Right.
and giving people control. And that's really where it comes down to anyway, because it's our individual decisions that are going to change our own lives. Like the institution can be like, oh, we have to do this and do this and do this. And it might be everything that we need to do. But until we decide to do it, it's not going to change anything. So
Right.
there
Yeah,
needs to be that crosstalk.
yeah, and I've talked with basically the past 9 or 10 guests about this, but the NIH, the CDC, people tend to think of them as these objective third party scientific agencies. But if you look at, say, for example, the CDC, I know like 10 years ago they said, oh, we don't receive any funding from the pharmaceutical companies. And then a few years ago they came out and said, oh, I think it's 46% of their annual operating budget comes
Mm.
from the pharmaceutical companies. So it's literally the fox guarding the hen house.
Mm.
And I don't know what the stats are today, but like 10 years ago, 9 out of the 18 member panel that approves drugs at the FDA have either current or former ties to the pharmaceutical companies.
Hmm.
And so if you look, the rise of statin drugs coincided with we stopped giving T4, T3 combos. I mean, functional medicine does, but or straight T3 because cholesterol and thyroid levels are inversely related. And so cholesterol being elevated used to be an indicator of subclinical hypothyroidism. And then as the statins came on the market, we stopped prescribing thyroid. We started prescribing statins, which I'm not saying never use a statin, but there's a gene called SLC01B1 that tells you if you're a good candidate for statin. There are other factors that go into that decision, but mitochondrial damage that can contribute to diabetes, Alzheimer's. 30% of our cell membranes are made of cholesterol. So, and not to mention it's the precursor to every hormone in the body because it gets converted into pregnenolone. But yeah, I think taking science, I mean, now I see, like, I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Chris Palmer. He's a psychiatrist at Harvard. And he wrote a book. It's on basically the mitochondrial, it's not really a theory, but it's basically proven, but the mitochondrial theory of, mental health issues and
I've heard of
disorders.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, he posted recently, I think it was in Maryland, they were doing a study on schizophrenic patients and they put them on a ketogenic diet. And it was like some crazy number. I think it was above 50%, saw significant improvement. Some like were able to live independently and things. But
Wow.
the Maryland Director of Health and Human Services yanked the funding for the project. And so, but going back to Dr. Palmer, he's at Harvard, he's on faculty at Harvard, but he, talks about all this, well, what academia would call woo-woo, even though it's biochemistry and physiology. And so you see more and more people being open to it in academia. I think, when you see one researcher or doctor doing it, then you're like, okay, well, I can do this too. And they can't fire everyone, right? Um,
Right.
and so I think, I know there's a website now where you can look up your healthcare provider and see if they've received funding and how much from pharmaceutical industries. And there's a guy, Dr. Zach Bush. He's a triple board certified MD. He has a good product called Ion Biome or gut healing. But he talked about he was doing research in a lab, I think it's like 10 or 12 years ago, and he discovered a derivative of vitamin A that had very strong anti-cancer properties. And so he called up one of the pharma companies and he was really excited and they asked him some questions and then they hung up on him. And so the next day or 2 days later, he goes to his advisor and tells them, and she goes, well, you never should have called. There's something called a blocking patent. So if they find
Mm.
out about something, they will file a patent, never intending to take it to market, but to prevent anyone
Mm.
else from taking it to market.
Yep. My husband's an entrepreneur and does patent stuff all the time. And so, yes, that happens a lot.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people hear that and they say, oh, that's conspiracy. But no, it really,
It's
it,
business.
yeah, it's business. But you would think, I mean, there's enough patients to go around, right? Um,
Exactly.
I mean, right now it's affecting our country economically. And we're paying the price, like the fatal conveniences that Darren Olean
Hmm.
talks about. But I think going back to the evolutionary biology in terms of time outside, I read a stat. I've seen it a few times over the past 6 months. We spend 95 to 98% of our time indoors. And I love being outside, but I'm in South Carolina right now, and it's hot, but it's also extremely humid. And
Hmm.
so I have a little pug, and I can't walk her because of the brachiocephalic face. During the middle of the day, it has to be really early in the morning or really late at night. Do you talk about that in the origin of being?
Yeah. So the last section of our book is our relationship with nature and how, well, first of all, nature basically is where we evolved. And it basically gives us everything we've needed ever in our lives to live. It gives us all of our resources, clean air, clean water, food, resources to make, to make anything. It all comes from the earth. And when we evolved and when we became, hunter gatherers and on the human lineage, we started to become aware that this, nature was why we were alive, and so they revered nature. They had the, gods were in the animals and in the rocks, and they had this concept of, you know we are not above nature. We are with nature, we are here with nature, even maybe below it. And it's our job to, they weren't tree huggers, but they did have stewardship and respect and reverence for nature. Um, and so people are like, okay, we'll connect with nature, but so to help nature, but also people don't realize the effects that nature has on us. We take a walk in nature and all of our cortisol levels go down. We have this fight or flight all the time, but if you go and take a walk in nature, you have this uh, stress. This is stress reduction hypothesis, where natural environments like promote recovery from the stress response, because there's low levels of information to be processed, and it's slow. And so when you're in a big city, honking horn, people walking this way, exhaust, signs, neon, and then you're in nature and things are just calmer, and it, totally just resets your physiology too. Um, so we talk about, on both sides, what we need to restore a relationship with nature, not only for ourselves, but also for our environment, because we are nature. We're not above
Yeah.
nature. We came from nature. Nature provides us with everything we need to live. And so I feel like it's a pretty important chapter. I almost feel like it was my favorite chapter to do and to write. But I almost feel like it kind of ties everything together, because nature is where we evolve circadian rhythms. That's why we sleep. Our evolution of sleep happened because of nature. We evolved our nutrition. Nature provides us nutrition. Where do we work? We work getting food. We rest late, in a stream. Everything that we need is provided by nature. So that's a real cornerstone, I think, of this basic needs book.
Mhm.
Because we need that nature as much as nature needs us.
And Paul Chek has another great saying: "What we do to nature, we directly do to
Mhm.
ourselves." If you think about, we don't rotate our crops with regenerative agriculture, so the soil is depleted of minerals. Well, we have an epidemic of mineral imbalances,
Mhm.
right? And so, if you look at a supplement like Tribulus that's used in men to raise testosterone, um, the studies, they don't tell you this, but it has to be from Bulgaria to be legitimate Tribulus to raise testosterone, and it has to do with the regenerative farming practices and the mineral content of the soil.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, and again, if we look at something like glyphosate, it supposedly helps the crops, but it damages our microbiome. And the way they got it approved is they said, well, humans don't have the Shikimate pathway, which is in the gut microbiome. There's a lady named Dr. Stephanie Seneff at MIT who studies this. And so it's semantics, right? So technically humans don't, but our microbiome does. And that
Mhm.
controls most of our physiology, at least impacts it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so again, the glyphosate, we have an epidemic of, not breastfeeding long enough, toxic foods and, contaminated with glyphosate and other chemicals, overprescribing antibiotics. And then, we're disconnected, we're on our screens, we're staying up too late. And then we're like, oh man, why are we sick? I'm like,
Right.
how are we not sick? Like the body's
Right.
incredibly resilient. Like I'm surprised it withstood that many
That
stressors.
much. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, the body is resilient. So somebody deciding to make a different choice, it's never too late. I mean, your body has this amazing ability to heal. I'm sure you've had patients who have just had miraculous, not miraculous, it's science, and it's your body, but like turnarounds in their health just by making the changes, You know, some people are like, well, it's too late. You know, I already have diabetes, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's not too late. You can
Right.
really change your lifestyle. And I think, you know, going into the toxic, what did you call it? Toxic convenience or whatever. What was that called?
Fatal
Toxic,
conveniences.
yeah, fatal conveniences. I feel like our whole life, everything in our life is based on convenience. And I feel like if we can just stop and slow down and not do things because it's convenient, but do things because it's healthy for us, you know, getting on our screens is convenient. You know, eating packaged food is convenient. Having everything in plastic and throwing it away is convenient. Everything is convenience culture, and consumption culture. And so we need to slow down and really be more connected with what we actually need. Um, and be more present in the present moment so we can see what our bodies actually are telling us, because everything's just, we used to be able to listen to our bodies and know, I'm hungry, I'm tired, I need to rest, you know, I'm not feeling good today, I need to, you know, go eat this herb or something. um we don't listen to our bodies because there's so much convenience being thrown at us. We just, we're deaf to what our
Yeah,
bodies actually need.
absolutely. And you mentioned something before about being present and how that was tied into our evolutionary biology.
Mhm.
Can you touch on that again?
Yeah, well, I think it's a survival trait. And it was the way that our ancestors viewed time. So first of all, if you are living in nature and you're thinking about something that's going to happen in the future and you're just walking along, you're not paying attention to what the weather's doing. You're not paying attention if there's any predators around. You're not paying attention to see whether or not, oh, you know, I need to tell, you know, there's some good food here. We need to come back. Or I saw prey that we need to go after. It
Right.
was really important for our ancestors to live in the present moment for their own survival. Um, as well as like their, so for their, like the environment part, but also being in the present moment with their bodies. Um, not like putting things off, like, oh, you know, I have a headache, but I'm going to go to work anyway, you know, or, you know, I think there was just this mindset of being in the moment, and they thought, they viewed time as a very circular thing, whereas, you know, we view time more linear. And also, they had the way that they worked and the way they consumed their food is called, coined to be an immediate return economy. So whatever they did, they harvested, you know, berries, and immediately they brought it back and they shared it and they ate the berries. So everything was tied, you know, their actions were tied to what they needed in that moment. So now bring in agriculture, and now we plant seeds and we have to wait until the crops come up. And so now we're living in a delayed return economy. So we do something now, but we don't reap the benefits for until months later. You know, we do the work now, but we get money a month later. And so that totally changed how we view time. We're now very future oriented. We're very linear. So a lot of people live in the future, worrying about stuff that might never happen. And a lot of people, you know, worry, you know, think about the past, and there's
Mhm.
nothing they could do to change it, but they live in the past. And so I'm really happy to see that the meditation, mindfulness, you know, it used to be called frou-frou, like you said, but there's really genuinely serious, you know, scientific studies about how those things are actually really good for us, because that's how we evolved to be. You know, when
Right.
once, if we can be return to being in alignment with our you know, what our biology needs, we're gonna feel so much better. And being in the present moment is how we evolved to be for our own
Right.
survival.
Yeah. I mean, I remember just 12, 15 years ago, meditation, things like that were thought to be like the occult, like the dark arts, so to speak. Back in 2017, 2018, I was in Atlanta, and the practice I worked at, we had a lady come in and I said, you know, how's your meditation going? She said, Dr. Tim, I got to be honest, I can't do that. And I said, why? And she said, that's the work of the devil.
Oh my gosh.
And I said, okay, well, you don't have to, like, you know, cross your legs and say, just go sit in a dark room with no noise, cell phone, TV, lights off, you know, no distractions. And so, there's structural changes in the brain, right?
Mhm, mhm,
Neural circuitry gets rewired. Um, we get decreased information overload. And I think one thing that goes unnoticed is I call it the neurological diet. We're focused on what we put in our mouth, but not
mhm,
what we put in our nervous system. And we're
mhm,
not meant to consume information constantly and constantly. When I went to undergrad at Wake Forest, it was difficult academically, but I did well. And at first I was like, why does this kind of seem easier to me? But it's because, we weren't meant to like just sit and learn new information for 6 to 8 hours. Like, you have 1 hour blocks or 2 hour
mhm,
blocks, and then you have a break. And I mean, for me, that worked well with my biorhythms. Just sitting in a classroom or lab for 6 to 8 hours, that does not work well for me.
mhm,
And I think a lot of times, actually, a colleague of mine who's a psychiatrist was telling me about a school system in Greensboro, North Carolina. And there was a specific type of education plan that they implemented. The school was at the very bottom, or like the second from the bottom. And they implemented this plan where if a child felt like he or she needed to stand up and walk around to get some energy out, they allowed them to do that along with a few other things. And over the course of like 2 years, they went from the very bottom to almost at the very top.
mhm. Yeah, I've read things like that, many, many things like that, especially for, the child rearing section. People are like, they're so result oriented in school, they're taking away recess and breaks for more instruction time when all of the movement of their bodies, the social interactions they have at recess, all of those things are so important for a child's mental development, not just what they know.
Yeah,
And it also, if they have this where they can do what they need to do and they learn what they learn what they need to learn, they can follow and really get deep into something that they really like, something that they're passionate about. Because I remember, I kind of felt the same way. I felt like we were just learning information to regurgitate. I never appreciated what it was like to actually learn something. I was,
right.
it was like just this rote thing, you need to know it for the test, and I had this attitude like I have to get an A. So I remember all of these things just to get the A. And I never really learned until much later in my life how to enjoy learning,
Yep,
rather than just have it shoved down your throat, and I feel like that's I know that happens to my kids. They are not necessarily very happy that school's about to start.
yeah,
They, because again, it's like trying to fit everything in a box. They're outliers everywhere, and not, the what works for the majority of the people don't work doesn't work for everybody. Um,
yeah,
so yeah, there's just so many different things that are like that, that society like puts these limits on or narrows the focus, or when we really just need to be open, and have our minds be open to learning
absolutely.
whenever, wherever, and however the kid is the most, if they're a visual learner or they learn by doing or they learn by reading, or there's so many different ways than just sitting in a classroom and
Absolutely.
memorizing stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think gross anatomy would have been so much easier if we would have been able to dissect a cadaver or, work on this part of the cadaver and then, um, go straight into the clinical setting and talk about how it was clinically relevant versus just origin, insertion, action, innervation, da, 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 da. But hopefully, we move more in that direction over time. In
Yeah.
regards to your own knowledge and development, what's something you know today that you wish you would have known 10, maybe 12 years ago?
Um, well, I think maybe it was a little longer. I was starting to learn these things, like the way that my depression and my anxiety and not being happy, it wasn't my fault, right? I didn't know any better. Um, but it was how I had been raised, how society raised me, how I was living, how what I was putting in my body, what I was putting in my brain, what I had psychologically going on in my brain, having to be perfect and having to, be straight A's and things like that. Um, once I learned that that's just not a natural way to be, that's society. That's natural for society. That's not natural for a human's needs. Um, and so I wish I had known that, you know, it wasn't my fault that I had some of these things going on. I mean, if you don't know, you don't know, And so
Right.
once, and that there's another way. There's a way that people always do things. And if that way doesn't work for you and you do it something somewhere different, there's no reason to have shame. Like if you have to step out of the rat race, there shouldn't be shame in that. You're doing something for yourself. Everyone's different. And so I wish I just had this knowledge that, I was just caught up in, this fast running river, and everyone's caught up in it. And some people are okay in the river, but some people really need to get out, and it's okay to step out, and there's other options that you
Yeah,
can choose to
because
do.
absolutely. I work from home now, virtually, but it's funny to hear people say, "Oh, well, you have such an easy life. I see you going to the gym at, 1 p.m. or 2 p.m." I'm like, okay, so what is it supposed to look like? Am I supposed
Mhm,
to be pulling my hair out, stressed, like crying? Like that's like we've normalized pathology, and
mhm,
that's not good. I
right?
mean, a lot of times people say, "Oh, well, that's normal." I'm like, no, what you mean is it's common. It's not normal.
Yeah, I've had that
Common and
same thing. Yeah, heard that same thing applied to those diseases, that you get after 60. It's just part of aging. You
yeah,
know, Everyone gets fat, everybody's hormones change. Everybody has, glu- you know, um, glucose sensitivities, if not diabetes.
right,
Um, but it's common, but it's not normal.
right. Absolutely. Where can people find the book?
Yeah, well, we have a website. It's www.ontheoriginofbeing.com. That has information about Luke and I. It has links to where to buy the book. I'm also pretty active on Instagram, on the origin of being. Um, and yeah, it's on any online retailer to buy. So hopefully people get a lot out of it.
Yeah, we'll put up the links. And thank you so much for your time. Keep up the great work, and I look forward to reading the
Thanks.
book.
Thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate talking to you today.
Absolutely. Take care, Dr. Jenny.
You too.